Hello and welcome. The government released a National Achievement Survey on for schools and school children last month. That's May 2021. This was conducted last year. This assesses the health of the school education system of the country and looks at a comprehensive evaluation of children's learning competence at class 3, 5, 8 and 9. Now, there were a lot of interesting findings. This survey covered about 3.4 million students, 118,000 schools in about 720 rural and urban districts. So amongst the findings, there was a 9 percentage point fall between 2017, that was when the last survey was conducted, in 21 in performance. 24% of students surveyed did not have access to digital devices, something which obviously becomes stark in the context of COVID-19. Many of them, almost 37%, said that they faced difficulty learning at home. Now, this is one survey that's a large one, and there are many surveys which have been done, including the well-known ACER survey, which looks at learning outcomes. The question that we are trying to address today, however, is a little different. Our research in the context of education efforts and initiatives, asking the right questions and obviously therefore getting the right answers, and to what extent are we not asking the right questions, and who should we be working with, or who are the people who should be driving not just the asking of questions but also in many ways setting of the questions as distinct from those who are doing it today. So that's the question that we are posing, and to answer that is Anurag Behar, CEO of the Azim Premji Foundation, also Chief Sustainability Officer at Wipro and Vice Chancellor of Azim Premji University. The Azim Premji Foundation runs institutions and programs in India for improving school education and for others of human development. It focuses on 7 states in India which have over 350,000 schools. The foundation also runs the Azim Premji University, which I referred to, and Anurag also serves as president of this university. Importantly, in this context, he's also been a member of the committee that developed India's National Education Policy 2019. Anurag, thank you very much for joining me. So let me ask you the straight question. I mentioned the National Achievement Survey only to place research in a certain context, but tell us about what bothers you today when you look at research in general and specific when it comes to assessing what's happening in the world of education, particularly schools.
Thank you, Govind. Pleasure to be here with you. Actually, research is sort of secondary. You know, what concerns all of us is that why is it that the quality of education that we have in our country and much across the world is not what we want it to be. So it's quite clear, and I don't think there's anybody who says that we have the kind of quality in education that we want it to be. So I think that's the question. The question really is, how do we improve quality? And quality has many aspects. Our children learning exactly what we want them to learn at the age we want them to learn. When we say, what do we want them to learn? It's not just math and physics and language, which of course it is, but is it the values that we want education to develop? So education is this, wonderful and complex process through the education system that we have set up, which essentially develops our children to become responsible, engaged citizens of the world. So are we delivering on all that? And subjects are a part of that. And I think that's what concerns all of us. So I think the important question here is that then is research, or the kind of research that is being done or is done, is it serving this purpose of improving education? So I think it's, in some senses, if we stay focused on that basic, on that very basic, then we'll get to some, I think, reasonable conclusions. And when you look at that particular matter, that is then research focused on this basic matter of how do we improve education, my sense is that we are falling way short, and we are falling way short in terms of both, let's say, the amount of research that we are doing, and also the kind of research that we're doing. And I'm not talking about, let's say, the quality or the rigor of the research work, but let's say just the amount of research and the kind of research that we're doing. So we are falling way short, and there are many, I would guess, many complex reasons for that, really.
Right. So, you've said, for example, that we need to fundamentally change the power equations in our research ecosystems. And I'm only quoting from your article that appeared in the Mint recently. And you've also said that the voice and role of practitioners is so non-existent in the research ecosystem and power so concentrated with academia and policymakers that active involvement could sidestep the basic changes required and maintain the status quo. So, there must be some examples which jump out when you talk about the gaps that, let's say, research is not bringing out.
Yeah, we can take many examples. In fact, it'll be fascinating for anybody to pick up, a research journal in education and look at the kind of things that are researched, and you will see the kind of issues that. Let me describe those issues to you. So. Why go far away from home? We can confess to our own mistakes, right? So there was a time that we did this extraordinarily rigorous, there's no quarrel with the rigor. We did this extraordinarily rigorous randomized controlled trial based research, and we did it for 5 years. And at the end of that entire research, if you just take away the spin that I might give it to give it a positive note. Basically, what we discovered is that, if for the same number of children, there are 2 teachers versus 1 teacher, then children learn better. Now, is that something that needs to be rediscovered? Why did we frame the research? Why did we ask that question at all? Why did we ask that question which in somehow led us in that direction? So, this is one kind of research where what happens is that you end up asking questions when you're distanced, which seem, you're going to discover something wonderful, but eventually you're discovering something which is the obvious. I mean, anybody in education would know this, or not in education would know this. So some of this stuff is that we are rediscovering the obvious. And that issue is because of the distance that you have from the particular matter on hand. So, I sitting in Bangalore, in my office, I think of something and, I think this must be researched. And by the way, we have a university and we have the money and therefore we fund it and we go on and do it. Too much of research, which is rediscovering the obvious. Let me talk about a second category. And the second category is where what's happening is that, you're researching something that is so particular, right? So it's worthwhile to research it, but you can't carry that anywhere else. The notion of some universal learning that you will have, and because that word research is so imbued with meaning now, that somehow when you do research, something comes out which has, large scale, perhaps universal implications, right? That's not what is happening. You're researching something so particular that the implications of that are very little. I'll give you an example. How much is a local community of parents and the broader community, perhaps in a village, how engaged is that community with the school? It's a very important determinant of what goes on in the school. We know that, right? Again, that's a reasonably obvious thing. Now, if you start researching as to how did a particular school do a fantastic job of engaging the community and the parents, you learn how they did it, but the translatability of what you discover from there is very little beyond that particular school. Why? Because the overall principles of how the school would engage with the community are fairly well known. Now, how you implement that in a particular village, a particular mohalla, is a matter of human interaction and human dynamics, right? So it's like saying that, how do you do good parenting, right? So how do you do good parenting? I mean, we can all read all kinds of books on the principles of good parenting, but eventually when it comes down to parenting, we're parenting, right? So that's what I mean by a lot of the stuff is very obvious. A lot of the stuff is very particular. And then, which is perhaps the most wasteful of all, is a lot of the stuff is very trivial. So if you're actually inside education, and that's why I was talking to practitioners, I mean, it's such a trivial thing. I mean, like in that particular piece that you're mentioning, I have mentioned that you research that what is the implication of having a boundary wall on the learning level of children. I mean, like, why would you research that, right? I mean, if you were to research what is the effect of a boundary wall on children's safety, one can understand that. But why would research something of that nature? But, it sounds like a good question if you're distanced from the reality and you think that somehow it must be playing a role. And you also go around hunting for secondary literature and you figure out that that's something that you're interested in and you go after it because perhaps you're in a university and you can get the funding for it, right? So you have this, the obvious is being researched, the particular is being researched, and the trivial is being researched. And sometimes, sometimes these kind of things they are not neat categories. They sort of intersect. A classic example of the intersectional category is, let's say, I want to do a similar RCT I want to do on what is going to happen, and I'll have some questions in the research paper. What's going to happen if you start placing cameras in classrooms? Right? Oh, attendance will go up. Yeah, or we can observe how teachers are teaching. We can tell them how to teach better. Do you need to do that? Don't you know how human beings react when you have a camera intruding in their workspace of that kind, or which is in some senses, a personal space? Don't you know that? There are ethical issues, there are basic human issues, but why would you do something of that nature, right? It's not the most important thing to do, and you're disconnected, therefore you have this, let's call it hypothesis, which you're trying to test. So, Govind, this is, and please do not, in a country of our size, I must not suggest that all research and every individual or all organizations are doing things of this kind. Of course, there's good research happening. Of course, people are doing wonderful work, but it's just too little. Most of it is stuff like this.
Right. So, you've said that we are caught in this double bind. Those who know what needs to be researched do not have the capacity, and those who have the research capacity are too often disconnected from reality. So, let me somewhat journalistically ask you to highlight the 3 things that you feel we should be focusing more attention on, and maybe the 2 or 3 things we should not be focusing attention on, purely from your vantage point.
So, Govind, I will also do the journalistic thing of sidestepping your question, actually. So, which is this, that, I don't think it's possible to do that. You can't say 3 things on this side and 3 things on that side. The categories, as I mentioned, you can talk about. Yeah. And the reason is quite simple. I want to go back to where I started. But the key issue in Indian education is, let's figure out how do we improve things. That's the key issue, right? We don't need to do more research on how do we characterize Indian education, explain Indian education, all that kind of stuff. We need to figure out how to improve things. Now, the thing is that, and please don't take my my numbers too seriously. I'm just saying it from a perspective of putting some flesh to. So, 95%, 98% of the issues that are to do with how can one improve education, those issues are well understood. We have a problem with our teacher education system. We know that. We have a pathetic teacher education system, the B.Ed system. It's poor quality, it's corrupt, and so on and so forth. It's been known for a while. The National Education Policy 2020 has done, I think, a fantastic job of confronting that issue. That needs to be fixed, we don't need to, what do we research there? You've got shops which are selling B.Ed degrees. You got to shut them down, right? And you got to start a lot of new good programs inside good institutions, right? So, what are you going to do there, right? So, examinations, and I'm using a few of the key matters, right? So, examinations. We know we are too dependent on examinations, on assessing our children, and those examinations are too rote or procedurally oriented. They don't really assess whether children have understood the concepts, can they apply those concepts, have they developed the capacity to think critically, and so on and so forth, right? So those things have to be, those examinations have to be changed, right? there are even simpler matters. We know that there are inadequate number of subject teachers in higher grades. We know that. They have to be appointed. So here's the thing. The thing is that at this kind of a level, it's not possible to say these are the big things that you should research on. Right? That's not possible. Similarly, what you should not do, I've already talked about. That's categories. They're not matters, right? So then if you ask me what one could do is that actually, and I'm coming from a structural perspective, what you could do is let the practitioners, which is the teachers, right? Teachers, the principals, the block education officers, or the people who are writing textbooks, they're also practitioners of a certain kind. Let them ask the questions that seem most important to them. Let them ask the questions that seem most important to them. Let them or let other people of similar kinds discover what works, because most kind of solutions we have, it's not as though if there's a challenge that a teacher is facing or a school is facing, some other school must be doing a good job of it, right? So let them discover that. And the most important thing is, if you recollect that second category that I talked about, particular, right? The most important thing is, let's drop the notion of universal learning from research projects in education. There is no universal learning, right? One should actually take the category of the particular that I talked about and imagine that if you do a better and better job of the particular, then those who face similar situations can be a lot more inspired by that. It will again have to be translated in their context. So that's where we stand. And will the requirements in education of research remain the same forever? I don't think so. If the matters that we are talking about change significantly, then perhaps the priorities in research would also change. But as I can see it over the next 10, 15 years, at a conceptual level, if we can let go of the notion that research is something which, first of all, let go of the notion that research should be explanatory, right? That we should just let go of. There's no point in trying to further explain, characterize, as to, for example, how inequity in our education is still determined by caste hierarchies. It is, we know that. There's no point in going around it. There's no point in, again, rediscovering that our teacher education is, very poor, it's suboptimal. So there's no point in doing all that. And then there's no point in discovering the obvious nor the trivial. You should take what I call the particular and then expand that basket and reconfigure our understanding of what research is used for in a field like education.
Right. So if I were to bring you to the present, and I use the National Achievement Survey as a start point, and there are some findings from that. So what, and again, in the context of COVID, where clearly 250 million children have not gone to school, of about 1.6 billion children globally, though India had perhaps the largest or the longest school closures. What are the kind of questions that you would like answered at this point of time, particularly that we are grappling with a traditional as well as a current problem?
So the questions are actually reasonably simple and reasonably clear. And one has to, again, and that's why, my emphasis on let the practitioners decide what the questions are, right? My emphasis on that. So if you're a practitioner, you're out in a school or in a classroom every day, the question is quite clear. The question is the following. The question is that if I am a teacher, or if there are 10 teachers in our school, that teacher who's teaching grade 6 or grade 7 or grade 8 is actually facing a classroom of, let's say, 25 children, where there are lots and lots of children, perhaps 15 of them, whose learning levels are perhaps at grade 3 or grade 4. So you're in class 7, but because you lost 2 years, and not just that you lost 2 years of teaching, but you've also children have also forgotten what they knew earlier. Therefore, you have children in that illustrative class 6 at the class 3 level. Then you have some children at class 4 level, some children at class 5 level, right? Now the question is that how as a teacher, I should handle this? That's the basic question that's striking. Now, are the pedagogical practices to teach children who are at class 3 level or class 4 level to bring them up to, let's say, class 6, those pedagogical practices are well understood. I mean, they don't need to be rediscovered. The question is, I as a teacher in that classroom, how can I be helped? Because actually I teach middle school. I have not really practiced this whole class 3 thing for a while now. So how will you help me? That is the question, right? The question is not what pedagogical practice to adopt. That anybody who's an effective, and I would say lakhs of effective teachers are there, they can tell you. Question is, when I'm facing the classroom, how can I do it? That is the question to answer. And what might be the answers? The answers might be, well, okay, this is the kind of a teacher handbook that needs to be developed such that this teacher who is unused to teaching children who are at that level can then be helped with the pedagogical practices. Or, I shouldn't say or, and these are the kind of teaching learning material, which is, workbooks and, let's say books that can be developed such that it is there inside the classroom where the teacher can use it. Or, and this is a very important one, that given the crunch of time that we have, the teacher is teaching class 6 and these children are at class 3 level, given the crunch of time that we have in terms of you'd like to get them back to the appropriate class level as soon as possible, what is it that we should be doing with our syllabus such that we can sort of reduce the syllabus without compromising on the learning outcomes that you would want? So essentially reduce content. That's what it means really, right? Now, these are the kind of things that are really urgent and important today. Right? And what happens is that, again, I'm oversimplifying the matter a bit, but just for the sake of communicating it, perhaps it makes sense, that the research ecosystem is disconnected from this. All this that I'm talking about is right now, it is so urgent and so important that it's just proceeding apace. So people are doing it, and it's not as though people are doing it without knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. The same practitioners in the state systems, in schools, in the State Council of Education, Research and Training, they're doing it. But there's no real research that is happening or has happened to inform this, right? So the research ecosystem is, I would say, more or less disconnected from this entire thing that's happening. What's going to happen is that a couple of years later, the research ecosystem will perhaps want to explain as to why is it that this part of the country did better, or how is it that state X did all this, which actually seems to have improved things a lot more, right? But if you go back to the basic point that education research needs to focus on improvement, so the research ecosystem, which is of a certain kind, and perhaps is too incented to publish papers, they should forget about publishing papers. They should get deeply into the matter on hand, jump into it, think of short cycle research to actually help construct that handbook that I talked about, or construct the teaching learning material that I talked about, or to help reconfigure the syllabus in an effective manner, right? So I hope that was not too complicated, Govind,
No, not at all. Not at all. So, two quick questions as we come to the end of our conversation. I think one is, what are you doing in this space? And as an active practitioner at a university level, what are you doing and what are you thinking of in order to address this gap as you see it? The second question is, you travel a lot, Anurag, you visit many schools across the country, mostly and in areas that you are working in. What are you bringing back at this point of time? Again, it's a somewhat post-COVID question, or if you can call it that, but I'm sure your insights would help.
That question about what we are doing, some of it is that I'm writing and talking to you about it. But more seriously, we've tried to do this because we have such a large team on the ground. We work, directly with, I would say, thousands and thousands of government schools. And therefore, we have tried to, our research, the research that we do, it has focused entirely on questions that arise from the ground in the here and now. In fact, it's because of this that this whole matter of learning loss, which is, rightly, the most important issue that the country is trying to tackle, we caught this issue very early. I mean, we caught this issue perhaps, I would say, by September, October of 2020. And that's how we were able to research it, I would say with fair amount of rigor, with a very large sample of students in December of 2020. And by Jan-Feb, we had that research report out, which is perhaps the first research report on learning loss, right? So we've really reconfigured, and it's taken us quite a bit. We were, like I mentioned, our own mistakes, right? I mean, that whole business. So it took us, I would say 5, 6, 7 years to reconfigure our own understanding of how do you determine research priorities, what are the questions to ask, and then how do you research them rigorously, but then yes, quickly enough so that they can be useful, right? So it's taken us a bit. And then what we've tried to do, I mean, we do that research, that kind of research within our organization. And then we've had a substantial program on external research grants that we give out to other organizations. And I must say that, we've been talking about school education, but any field of human action, right, whether it's public health or livelihoods or whatever you take, they're very similar fields. These are fields of action, right? I mean, they're not explanatory fields. Sociology or physics or chemistry or biology, these are explanatory fields. Here you should be researching and developing knowledge. You don't necessarily know what's going to come out of it, but expanding the frontiers of human knowledge in such explanatory fields is very useful, in itself. But what I'm calling the fields of action, such as education or public health or livelihoods, the dynamics in those fields is very akin to what we've been talking about in education.
Right. And there's an interesting example which you've used, which I want to mention here. You've said that economics could well be an explanatory field, but the avatar it's adopted for itself over the years is more that it's an action field, wanting to effect policy through action on the ground.
Yeah. So my economist friends, so long as they don't shoot me, well, it's a very simple thing, right? I mean, economics can be like, much like, let's say, political science or sociology. You're trying to explain and understand the world around you. And of course, a lot of economists, excellent economists, do that. And they don't claim that, therefore, their research should or must have some kind of or their voice, not just research, their voice should have some kind of an immediate implication on actions that are taken. So a lot of good economics research happens of that kind. But as all of us have noticed, economists in the field of economics seems to be, infiltrating everything: education, public health, of course, policy making, governance, everything, right? Now, there you're adopting the stance that I will contribute to, if not determine, what actions have to be taken. And then, therefore, you're transitioning from what I've been calling the explanatory field to a field of action. And when then you're a field of action, then the same dynamics govern you. I mean, right. Please ask questions that are relevant. Please think of issues that are directly important, right? And of course, then you also must hold yourself to the same standards of, effect, if I may call it that, as somebody researching in education. So that's what I meant by that statement.
Right. Last question, Anurag. So, I was referring to your travels, and which you have been doing consistently right through the last 2 years. What are you bringing back at this point of time? I mean, I know that you're seeing a lot of stories of optimism and good examples of maybe what other schools or schooling systems can replicate across the country.
So, Govind, let's start with the bad news first. The bad news is just a reaffirmation of what all of us know, that there's just a absolutely staggering loss of learning that is there. And it's, as I keep saying to everybody, it's nobody's fault, right? It's not the state government's fault. It is not the teacher's fault. It's nobody's fault. If schools were shut down, they were shut down and children have not learned. That's it. But that loss of learning is staggering. And it's across the board. It's in large schools, small schools, it's in urban areas, it's in rural areas. So I think that's the bad news. The good news is, first, that I think most state governments, and state governments are really responsible for running schools, most state governments over the past 5-6 months have started taking significant actions to try and recover lost learning. I don't think these actions across all states are adequate. I don't think they're adequately thought through. And of course, as we know, implementation is the crux of everything. But the important point is that what I saw, let's say 9 months ago, where too many states were in a state of denial, that's no longer there. So I think that's one very important thing. Second is that actually we know what to do, what we were talking about earlier. We know what to do. It's a question of how it has to be done. Third, there are extraordinarily heroic people. And when I say, I'm not talking about 10, 15, 20 people. I'm talking about, I would say, thousands and thousands and thousands of teachers who through the pandemic have somehow engaged with the children and who today are doing things that are way beyond the call of duty. Of course, way beyond what one would expect of an average teacher, but way beyond the call of their duty to just help these children who have lost 2 years of learning. So I think those are three really positive things that I see. And I must mention one more thing, and I hear about it a bit too much, so I thought I must share that. Is that, you see, given the number of children our country has, and it's such a wonderful thing, 250, 270 million children, it's very clear that the pandemic has had various kinds of effects, right? And there's no question that there is a very large number of children to whom not going to school has not only been an effect from a perspective of losing learning, but also if they've been cooped up in a small environment, perhaps mental health issues, and all kinds of psychosocial issues that have cropped up, right? That's true. However, my estimate is, from what I see on the ground, is that is a very small fraction. In terms of numbers, it might be very large because we have so many children. But in terms of from a proportion of the overall children of this country, that's a very small fraction. The very large proportion of the children actually have been very happy. And people like us in education won't want to admit it, but they've been very happy that schools have been shut, right? Very happy. Not that they've not missed school, but what happens is that, and particularly if you're talking about a village and a mohalla, the school was shut, but the ground was open, and there's the same children around. So they go to the ground, they're playing. It's not as though they're missing the social interaction. They're the same community, right? So, I find it wonderful that, in the face of this learning loss, children have found their wonderful ways and enjoyed what they've had. And one shouldn't grudge them that. I'm sure you and I, if we had 2 years of summer vacation, you would not have really grudged it, would we?
Right. Anurag Behar, that's a wonderful note to end on. Thinking back about the summer vacation we could have had or could not have had. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Govind. Thank you so much. Thanks.